The night the chains closed around her life began with drums beating far away across the savannah, their deep voices rolling like thunder under the stars. And the woman named Amara stood at the edge of the village firelight watching shadows dance on the mud walls, while the wind carried dust and sorrow through the acacia trees. She did not know then that this would be the last night she would see the open sky for 2 long years. Because betrayal often comes wearing the face you once trusted most. Amara was the wife of Kato. A respected warrior favored by the village elders, and blessed by the chief himself. Kato was tall, broad-shouldered, and known for his brave hunts and calm voice in council, yet behind his strength lived a hunger for power that the ancestors watched in silence. Amara had been chosen for him by elders, because her bloodline carried ancient whispers. Her grandmother was a healer who spoke to rivers, and her mother sang songs that calmed storms. Amara herself was gentle, but strong, her eyes always searching the horizon, as if listening to voices others could not hear. When she walked, the earth responded. When she stepped near the river, frogs fell silent, and the moonlight seemed to follow her. This made some fear her, and others envy her. Especially Nyara, the woman who would become the shadow in her story. Nyara arrived in the village during a dry season, thin as a reed, eyes sharp, like a snake, tongue sweet with lies. She claimed her family had died beyond the mountains, and she carried nothing but beads and a smile. The village took pity, and Kato took interest because Nyara fed the darkness inside him. She praised his strength, mocked Amara's quiet ways, and whispered that a man like him deserved more than a soft woman who spoke to spirits at night. Kato began visiting Nyara in secret beneath the baobab where the ancestors slept. And slowly his love turned into poison. Amara felt the change before she saw it. She heard it in the restless drums at night, and in dreams where chains wrapped around her wrists while a laughing woman stood behind her. One evening as the red sun sank into the land, Kato accused Amara before the elders, claiming she practiced dark magic against him, that she spoke to spirits to weaken his strength and steal his future. The elders murmured, fear spreads fast when it wears the mask of tradition. Amara tried to speak, but Nyara cried loudly, accusing Amara of cursing her womb and stealing her luck. The chief, old and tired, feared angering unseen forces, and ordered Amara held until the truth could be revealed. The guards took her that same night, tying her hands with rough rope. As the drums beat louder, as if warning the earth itself, she was dragged past the fire where Kato would not meet her eyes, and Nyara smiled softly, hidden behind her tears. The prison was not stone, but earth, a deep pit carved into the red ground near the forest edge, where spirits were said to roam at night. It smelled of damp soil, roots, and forgotten bones. A single opening above let in a blade of moonlight, and the sounds of hyenas laughing. Amara was thrown inside, and the opening sealed with heavy logs. As the village turned away, believing silence would protect them, days turned into weeks. Then moons passed, counting time by the way light shifted above her. Amara survived on thin porridge lowered by a rope and water that tasted of rust. Her body weakened, but her spirit did not, because in the darkness she began to hear voices clearer than ever before. The ancestors spoke through the soil, telling her stories of women buried and forgotten who later rose like storms. They told her that injustice awakens ancient debts, and that the earth remembers every tear. She pressed her ear to the wall and listened as roots whispered secrets of bloodlines and broken oaths. Outside, Kato rose in power, marrying Nyara, publicly claiming Amara had died in the pit, consumed by her own evil. The village celebrated harvest dances, unaware that every drumbeat echoed down to the prison, where Amara carved marks into the dirt, counting breaths, not days. Anger burned inside her, but it did not blind her, it sharpened her resolve. She remembered her grandmother's words that patience is the sharpest spear, and silence the deepest river. During the long nights, spirits visited her. Some came as wind, some as fireflies, some as dreams where she walked free beneath stars. They did not free her, yet they taught her to endure, and to remember every face, every word, every lie, because the earth would demand balance. 2 years passed, and the land changed. Drought returned then. Floods washed fields away, sickness crept through the village. Children cried at night, and elders whispered that the ancestors were displeased. Nyara wore fine beads, but could not stop shaking. Kato's strength faded, his dreams filled with a woman standing in fire, staring without blinking. The elders decided a ritual of cleansing was needed, and they would open the forgotten pit to see if the cursed woman's bones still polluted the land when the logs were lifted, and light poured down. Amara stood slowly, her hair matted. Skin scarred but eyes burning like coals, she did not scream, she did not beg, she only looked up and smiled. And in that smile lived every promise of ruin, because the day she was released was the day the truth would rise, and nothing built on betrayal would stand again. When Amara stepped out of the pit, the village gasped, because she looked like a spirit returned from the underworld. Her feet touched the earth slowly, as if greeting an old friend, and the wind moved through the acacia leaves in a low warning hiss. The elders stepped back, some raised their staffs, others whispered prayers, because no one expected a living woman after 2 years beneath the soil. Kato stood frozen, his face drained of color. As if the sun had burned all courage from him, Nyara clutched her beads so tightly. They cut into her palms, yet she forced a smile that trembled like a cracked pot. Amara said nothing, silence was her shield, and it terrified them more than screams could have. The chief ordered her washed and fed before judgment could be spoken, because tradition demanded respect even for the accused. She was taken to a small hut near the river, guarded by 2 young warriors whose eyes followed her with fear and curiosity. As water touched her skin, the river shivered, recognizing her blood. The women who washed her felt it too, and stepped away, murmuring that the spirits still walked with her, that night drums were forbidden. Yet no one slept, because dreams grew heavy with shadows. People heard footsteps where none walked, and Barbies cried, pointing at corners. Elders gathered and argued, saying the land suffered because truth was buried, while lies sat on the chief's stool. Kato tried to speak with the elders, blaming Nyara, blaming fear, blaming fate, but his words fell flat like dull blades. Nyara visited the shrine alone, offering goats and beads, begging the ancestors to protect her, yet the fire would not light, and smoke curled back into her face. As if rejecting her, Amara sat quietly in the hut, listening to everything through the walls. The spirits had sharpened her hearing. She knew when lies were spoken, because the air tightened, and when truth passed, the wind breathed freely. She learned that Kato planned a public trial, hoping to shame her again and end the whispers, but the ancestors had their own rhythm. The next morning, Kato was found dead near the forest edge, his body twisted, eyes wide, mouth filled with red dust. Elders read the signs and declared the forest angry. Another day. A granary collapsed without wind, spilling grain into the dirt. Women cried, men argued, and fear spread like fire in dry grass. People began visiting Amara secretly, bringing food and asking questions. They wanted to know what she saw in the darkness, and whether she could calm the land. Amara spoke, gently, never accusing, never begging. She said only that truth must walk in sunlight, and lies rot underground. Her calm frightened Nyara more than threats, because guilt knows when time is ending. Nyara's dreams turned violent. She saw Amara standing tall, while snakes wrapped around her own legs, dragging her down. She woke screaming, scratching her skin, until blood flowed. Kato grew restless, drinking more, avoiding the firelight, because he saw Amara's eyes in every flame. The chief announced the trial would take place at the old stone circle, where ancestors judged men and women alike. The whole village gathered, elders, seated warriors, standing, children silent, the air thick with tension. Drums beat slow and deep, calling spirits to witness. Amara walked forward, steady, chains removed, yet scars visible. She bowed to the elders, then faced Kato and Nyara without flinching. Kato accused her again of witchcraft, of weakening him, of bringing misfortune. Amara listened, then spoke for the first time, her voice soft yet strong, saying she had spoken. Spirits, yes, but only to heal, to protect, and to serve the land. She told them of the pit, of the darkness, of being buried alive. While lies danced in daylight, the elders shifted uncomfortably, because tradition had been twisted to serve desire. Nyara screamed, accusing Amara of cursing her womb and stealing her beauty. And at that moment, a gust of wind tore through the circle, knocking offerings over and extinguishing the fire. The oldest elder raised his staff, declaring that the ancestors demanded proof beyond words. A trial of truth would be held, calling upon ancient rites rarely used, because they exposed hearts completely. Nyara's face drained. Kato protested, but the people demanded it. Fear had turned into hunger for truth. That night preparations began, and Amara sat alone beneath the stars, feeling the earth pulse beneath her palms. The spirits whispered that the path ahead would not be easy, because truth destroys before it heals. She closed her eyes, knowing the rising tension was only the beginning. and that the land itself was holding its breath waiting for what would be revealed next. At dawn the stone circle was cleared and washed with river water mixed with ash and herbs. As elders moved slowly chanting names older than memory, the sky hung low grey and heavy. As if listening, Amara stood barefoot on the cold stones, feeling the pulse of the earth rise through her scars, while across from her Nyara trembled wrapped in bright cloth that could not hide the shaking of her hands, and Kato paced like a trapped animal. The trial of truth required 3 acts. The elders said the first was the memory. Walk where each accused must step into the forest alone and return with a truth. The forest would not allow lies. Hunters whispered that trees lean closer during this rite, and roots trip. The guilty Amara went first. She entered the forest calmly, the leaves brushing her shoulders like greetings. The light dimmed. But fear did not follow her. She remembered the pit, the whispers, the patience taught by darkness. She placed her palm on a baobab, and spoke her name, and the wrong done to her, the tree groaned, sap oozed. Like tears, and a bird cried. Once then silence, she returned holding a smooth black stone warm to the touch. The elders nodded, recognizing the stone of endurance. Nyara went next. The forest swallowed her quickly, and screams followed, then branches snapped. Time stretched, people shifted uneasily. When she stumbled back, her eyes wild, hands empty, claiming the forest stole her proof. Elders exchanged looks. Because the forest does not take from the innocent. Kato entered last with forced confidence, but minutes later thunder rolled and rain began without warning. He returned soaked, clutching a broken spear. The elders whispered that the forest had broken his full strength. The second act was the bowl of reflections, a clay bowl filled with sacred water placed between them. Each must speak while looking into it. The water would remain clear for truth, and darken for lies. Amara spoke of love, betrayed, of silence forced upon her, of surviving not to destroy, but to restore balance. The water shimmered clear, reflecting her face. Calm and strong, Nyara spoke next, accusing again, blaming fear, hunger, loss. Yet as she spoke the water clouded, turning red-brown like disturbed soil. Gasps rose. Kato shouted, denying planning the imprisonment, claiming elders ordered it. Yet the bowl cracked, spilling water onto his feet. The chief raised his hands, silencing the crowd, declaring one final act remained, the call of witnesses, where ancestors may choose to speak through signs. Drums began slow. Then faster, smoke rose straight, then twisted. A wind circled the stones, and from the crowd an old woman stepped forward, leaning on a stick, eyes white, yet seeing more than all. She was Amara's grandmother, thought long dead. She spoke in a voice not her own, saying the pit heard everything, the earth recorded every lie. She pointed at Nyara, who collapsed screaming, confessing that she fed Kato's fear, that she desired Amara's place, and whispered poison into his ear. Kato fell to his knees, finally breaking, admitting he chose ambition over love. The village cried and shouted, some in anger, some in shame. The elders judged Nyara to exile beyond the mountains and stripped Kato of rank, declaring he must face the consequences of his choices. Amara was offered power, wealth, revenge, but she asked only for the pit to be filled, and for the land to be healed. The ancestors approved. With a sudden clearing of the sky, sunlight broke through, and drums shifted to a hopeful rhythm. Yet Amara knew the turning point had only opened the door, because hearts once corrupted do not surrender. Quietly, and the greatest conflict was still gathering like a storm beyond the hills. The sun that followed the judgment felt false bright, as if the land itself did not fully trust the peace declared at the stone circle, because while Nyara was driven out, and Kato stripped of honor, the wounds left behind were deep and restless. Amara walked through the village, and people bowed, some in respect, some in guilt, some in fear. Children hid behind mothers, whispering that she was chosen by ancestors. Elders asked her to sit in council, yet she felt a heaviness pressing her chest, because balance, restored on the tongue, does not always settle in the heart. She sensed movement beyond the hills, a stirring like distant drums beating out of time. And at night the wind brought smells of ash and iron from the mountains, where Nyara had been exiled. Amara returned often to the river, kneeling where moonlight spilled silver on the water, speaking softly to her grandmother's spirit, asking why peace felt unfinished. The answer came not in words, but in a vision of fire crawling through dry grass, of warriors clashing under a red sky, and of Kato standing alone holding a blade pointed at his own shadow. Kato, meanwhile, lived in a small hut outside the village, no longer warrior, no longer husband, no longer respected. He watched Amara from a distance, torn between shame and rage, because though he had confessed, He had not accepted his fall. Every whisper, every bowed head burned him more than chains ever could. And he began to believe that Amara's mercy was another form of punishment. Nyara wandered the wild lands. Beyond the mountains, surviving on bitterness and hunger, where spirits are older and less forgiving, she found a ruined shrine buried in stone and thorns, a place avoided even by hunters, and there she cried out, offering her blood and hatred to any force that would listen. Something answered, not kindly, not loudly, but with a promise of power in exchange for obedience. Nyara's eyes darkened, and her steps grew steady as she learned to call shadows and twist dreams back. In the village, sickness returned, goats died without wounds, crops yellowed, and the river ran low. Elders argued whether exile had been enough, and some whispered that Amara should have demanded harsher punishment, because mercy had left the door open. Amara felt the shift in the air and knew the spirits were restless, because justice incomplete rots into danger. One night, the drums beat without hands and warriors ran to the edge of the village, seeing fire on the hills. Nyara had returned not as a woman, but as a vessel carrying ancient anger. She spoke curses that turned fear into weapons. Men fought, brothers, mothers fled, children cried. And in the chaos, Kato seized a spear, believing he could end the storm by killing its source. He faced Nyara, who laughed, revealing that both he and Amara were pieces in her sacrifice. She struck him down, not dead, but broken, and fled into the forest, drawing darkness behind her. Amara stood between the village and the wild, calling on ancestors, not for revenge, but for strength, knowing the emotional twist was cruel, because to heal the land she must face not only Nyara's hatred, but Kato's broken soul and her own pain that still bled beneath forgiveness. The spirits whispered that only truth walked through fire survives, and Amara stepped forward into the night, ready to confront the storm she had survived to face. The night of the great clash swallowed the land in thick darkness, broken only by firebrands and lightning. As Amara followed the trail Nyara left through the forest, the trees bent inward as if afraid, and the air smelled of blood, ash, and rain. Every step echoed with memories of the pit of betrayal, of silence forced upon her, yet she walked without hesitation, because the spirits marched with her, unseen drums pounding in her chest behind her. The village burned slowly, huts collapsing, while warriors fought shadows that moved like living smoke. Nyara stood at the heart of the forest clearing before the ruined shrine, her body painted with symbols glowing faintly, red eyes shining with borrowed power. She laughed when she saw Amara calling her pit woman, calling her ghost. But Amara did not answer with words. She raised her hands to the sky and called the ancestors by name. The ground shook, roots burst from the soil, wrapping around the stones. As wind howled, Nyara struck first, hurling curses that cut like blades. Memories flooded Amara's mind, chains closing, darkness choking her breath. She held firm, grounding herself in the earth, remembering patience, silence, endurance. Nyara summoned visions of Kato, screaming, of villagers blaming Amara for everything. But truth stood like a shield. The climax erupted as lightning struck the shrine, splitting stone and releasing ancient spirits. Trapped by Nyara's greed, they turned on her, screaming through her mouth, tearing the borrowed power apart. Kato crawled into the clearing, wounded and broken, witnessing the ruin his choices had built. He begged Amara to end it, to end him, but she refused, saying balance is not blood, but understanding. Nyara collapsed, screaming, as the spirits abandoned her, leaving her empty, powerless. Human again, the forest fell silent, rain washed blood from the soil. Amara stood over Nyara and spoke judgment, not as wife, not as victim, but as voice of the land. Nyara was bound to serve the village. She tried to destroy, rebuilding what she burned until her last breath. Kato was ordered to wander, carrying water and healing those he once led, until his strength returned in service, not pride. The spirits withdrew, satisfied. The storm ended, and dawn crept over the savannah, revealing a land scarred, but breathing again. Amara returned to the village, not as queen, not as ruler, but as guardian of balance, knowing the greatest victory was not ruin, but the breaking of the cycle. That night the drums beat slow and deep, not for war, but for survival, and every beat carried the truth that the climax of suffering can become the birth of wisdom when guided by patience and courage. When the sun rose after the night of judgment, it did not rush into the sky, but climbed slowly, as if giving the land time to breathe and remember who it was before hatred scarred it. Amara stood at the edge of the village, watching smoke lift gently from cooking fires rebuilt by hands that once trembled with fear. Children laughed again, chasing each other through dust that no longer felt. Cursed elders walked with lighter steps, and the drums that morning carried a steady calm rhythm, the kind played after storms. When survival itself becomes a song, Nyara began her punishment at dawn, bound not by rope, but by oath. She worked beside those she harmed, rebuilding huts, carrying water, planting seed under the watch of the elders. Her pride broken more painfully than her body ever could, and each night she slept without firelight, learning the weight of consequences. Because power taken through cruelty leaves only emptiness. Kato left the village before the heat grew heavy, his spear on his head, lowered, carrying goods of distant settlements where sickness still lingered, healing others in silence, learning humility step by step. The path was long and lonely, but it was the only road left to him. Amara refused the chief's offer of a throne, saying the land did not need another ruler. But a listener she chose instead, to live near the river, teaching children songs her grandmother once sang, and guiding women who felt unseen, reminding them that strength does not shout, and patience does not mean weakness. Seasons passed, rains returned, crops grew full, and the forest no longer whispered in pain. But in balance, travelers came to hear the story of the woman buried, and returned. Some expected vengeance, others magic, yet Amara spoke only truth. She told them injustice may bury the body, but it awakens the earth. Lies may rise quickly, but they sink when truth stands still. She taught that power without conscience destroys both the holder and the land, and that mercy is not forgetting, but choosing a future not chained to hate. The ancestors watched pleased, because balance had been restored not through ruin, but through understanding, and the moral settled deep into the village like roots into soil. That betrayal plants storms, but patience grows shelter, that silence can sharpen the spirit, that revenge ends cycles, but justice heals generations. And so the tale lived on, carried by drums, wind, and firelight, warning all who listen that those who imprison others with lies dig pits for themselves, and that the earth always remembers who stood for truth when darkness tried to win. The seasons turned slowly after the night when truth broke the storm, and the land watched itself heal with quiet patience, as Amara became a living symbol of balance, not through command, but through example. Every morning, she walked the riverbanks, greeting the water and the birds, teaching children to listen before speaking, and to feel the ground beneath their feet, because the earth remembers everything. Nyara worked from sunrise to nightfall, rebuilding what her hatred had burned. Her hands blistered, her back bent, and for the first time she tasted the bitterness she once fed others, and in that bitterness understanding began to grow. She no longer spoke of destiny or injustice, only of effort and regret. And when villagers passed, they saw not a monster, but a warning of what envy becomes when fed too long. Kato's journey was harder still. He walked village to village, carrying water to the sick, repairing fences, digging grave for strangers who would never know his name, and each step stripped away the pride that once ruled him, until he learned that strength is proven by service, not fear. When he finally returned, seasons later, thinner, quieter, and older in the eyes, he did not ask forgiveness. He offered work and silence, and the elders allowed him to stay at the edge of the village where humility could continue its lesson. The land responded to these changes. Rains fell when seeds were planted, winds cooled the heat, and the forest sang again. Without pain, Amara refused every offer of wealth or title, choosing instead guard the old stories, reminding the people that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that revenge poisons the hand that holds it. She taught that lies can lock bodies in pits, but truth walks free even in darkness, and that patience sharpens the soul more than anger ever could. As years passed, the tale spread across savanna and mountains, carried by traders and drummers, warning future generations that betrayal may rise fast, but it always collapses under the weight of truth. And so the moral lived strong and clear, that those who imprison others through lies and cruelty build their own ruin, while those who endure with truth and patience restore not only themselves, but the world around them, and the earth remembers all. The final season arrived quietly, not with thunder or fire, but with a deep stillness that settled over the land like a long breath finally released. And the village understood that the story which began in betrayal had reached the moment where meaning must be sealed. Amara felt it before anyone else, because the earth spoke to her through the soles of her feet, and the river changed its song when she knelt beside it at dawn. The water flowed steady, clear, and strong no longer restless or wounded, and the ancestors whispered that balance had returned, but balance must be taught, or it will be forgotten. She rose, and walked through the village watching life continue, huts repaired, fields green, children laughing, elders arguing gently over nothing important, and she knew the true ending of a story is not punishment or victory. But learning Nyara's transformation was slow and painful. Each sunrise, she lifted stones, rebuilt walls, carried water, and planted seed under the sun that showed no mercy, and in that labor her bitterness melted into shame, then into understanding. Villagers no longer cursed her, but neither did they comfort her, because forgiveness is not a gift taken. It is a bridge built from both sides, and Nyara learned patience through silence. Nights were the hardest, when firelight danced on walls and memories returned of whispers, lies, and stolen smiles. She cried alone, knowing the spirits were no longer angry, but watchful, waiting to see if her change was true. Carter lived differently. His body bore scars, his hands rough from labor, his eyes lowered, not in fear, but in humility. He spoke little and listened much, carrying burdens for others without being asked. When sickness returned briefly during the rainy season, he worked without rest, tending fires, boiling herbs, digging channels to save crops. And the people saw that redemption is not words spoken once, but actions repeated until truth believes them. Amara gathered the village beneath the old baobab where her grandmother once taught her, and she told the story openly, not to shame, but to teach. She spoke of how fear dressed itself as tradition, how power without wisdom turns love into chains, and how silence can be either a prison or a weapon depending on who holds it. She showed the pit, now filled and covered with stones marked, so no one would forget, and children touched the earth, hearing how close darkness once came. Elders bowed their heads, accepting their failure to question lies spoken loudly, and Amara reminded them that leaders who fear truth invite disaster. She spoke to the women, saying patience is strength, but endurance does not mean surrender, and she spoke to the men, saying strength is protection, not control. And when she finished, the wind moved gently through the leaves, as if the ancestors approved. Seasons passed into years, and the village prospered not because it forgot pain, but because it remembered its cost. Travelers carried the tale across rivers and mountains, saying there once was a woman buried alive by betrayal, who returned not with vengeance but with justice. And because of her, the land healed, the moral settled deep into every heart. That lies may imprison bodies, but never truth. That envy invites ruin, that power gained through cruelty destroys the holder, and that patience guided by truth will outlive every chain. And so the story ended not with destruction, but with wisdom, because in the end his total ruin was not death or fire, but the loss of false power and the rise of truth, which stands longer than any throne, and the earth remembers forever. The years after Amara's return passed, slowly yet with purpose. The village moved, as if the land itself had exhaled, and settled into a rhythm that blended past sorrow with present healing. Amara rose each morning before the sun to walk along the riverbanks, touching water and stones, feeling their memory. As if the earth whispered secrets only she could hear, children ran beside her, laughing and shouting questions that tumbled over each other, their curiosity endless. And she answered gently, teaching them not only words but patience and attentiveness. The elders watched her from shaded porches, leaning on staffs and walls, their eyes softened by experience. They understood that power without wisdom had almost destroyed them, that fear could blind the strongest hearts, that silence could protect or suffocate, and that Amara's endurance had been a mirror for them to see themselves. The crops grew taller than ever before, the harvests full and sweet, because the land remembered who had honored it, even during suffering. The river flowed steady, and the forest breathed freely again. Birds returned their songs clear and unafraid of the nights that once brought dread. The animals sensed balance restored, and hunters no longer feared shadows, because darkness no longer carried malice. Amara would often climb the hills at dusk to watch the savannah stretch endless and golden. The wind carried scents of dry grass, of wildflowers that had returned, and of distant rains. The drums of the village beat softly in the distance, and she listened, remembering the nights of imprisonment, the pit, the darkness that had been her companion. She smiled faintly, knowing that each scar she bore was a lesson carved into her soul, and that the ancestors who had guided her still walked with her, unseen, teaching when words were not enough. Nyara completed her sentence of labor under the elders' decree, and when the final day arrived, she stood before them, bowed and trembling yet human at last. She asked for permission to leave the village. She spoke softly, acknowledging all the pain she had caused. The elders spoke in low voices, deliberating the right choice. The years of her work had shown remorse and diligence, yet her presence had carried danger. Until she understood humility at last, the elders consented, and she departed, walking through the forest and across the savannah, her shadow stretching long in the afternoon sun. The wind whispered warnings and blessings alike, that the one who wrongs may leave scars, but only the earth remembers truly. Her journey would take her far across riverlands and mountains, where she would rebuild life piece by piece, learning to plant without theft, to speak without envy, to carry responsibility without complaint. Kato lived differently. Now, he had returned to the village as a shadow of his former self, carrying no pride, no weapons. He mended fences for others, tended fires, boiled herbs, dug channels to save crops. And when sickness struck, he moved quickly, offering labor and protection. He spoke little, but his eyes spoke of lessons learned too late. The villagers watched him closely for years, understanding that redemption comes in action, not in confession, in silent work, not loud declarations, in serving the land and others without expectation. Amara continued her guidance, teaching the children the songs of her grandmother, teaching women to see strength not in force, but in patience. And in understanding their own power, the village flourished, not because the threat had disappeared, but because the people had learned from it. The pit remained at the edge of the forest, a simple mound of stones, unadorned yet marked with care, a reminder to all who pass that even when injustice is buried, it lingers, that truth endures when patience guides it, and that the land itself remembers every act, both cruel and kind. Travelers and traders carried the story across rivers and hills, across savannah and desert, telling of the woman who survived darkness and returned not with vengeance, but with justice. The tale shifted in retelling, growing wings, yet the moral remained that betrayal can imprison bodies, but never spirit, that patience and truth outweigh force and greed, and that wisdom rooted in endurance will always outlast the fleeting strength of those who choose cruelty. Amara never sought titles or wealth. She only sought to guide the land and its people, to remind them that the earth is a witness, that every word and every act is remembered, and that the cost of harming others is far greater than one imagines. Nights passed under stars she had not seen in her years underground. She would gaze upward, tracing constellations her grandmother had taught her, listening to the soft call of night birds, feeling the cool wind on her face, and knowing that life had returned to a rhythm of balance. Her hair silvered and her steps slower, but her presence was steady, her voice clear. The village learned from her example that true power is patience, that silence carries strength, and that the consequences of cruelty extend beyond the hand that strikes the victims, and that those who endure injustice with courage and truth become the living proof that the earth rewards balance in time. Nyara walked distant lands, carrying the memory of the destruction she caused, and the lessons she learned. She rebuilt homes for travelers, she planted seeds for strangers, she healed not with magic, but with effort and humility. She became known not as a feared sorceress, but as a woman who understood the cost of envy, and who learned the meaning of service. Kato's death came quietly under an acacia tree at the village's edge. He had lived many years in labor and humility, his eyes closed finally with the satisfaction of a man who had understood the lesson too late, yet who had completed his journey. Nonetheless, the pit remained a place of memory. Children touched the stones and elders told the story, each telling, shaping the next generation. The moral of the story was etched into hearts and minds, that lies may imprison bodies, but never the truth that envy and cruelty destroy, first the bearer, then all around, that patience and courage endure when vengeance falters, and that wisdom grows not from victory, but from understanding the consequences of every act. The drums carried the story across savannah, rivers, mountains and valleys, announcing to all who listened that one woman's endurance had restored balance, and that the land and its people must honor truth for generations. The wind carried the story. At night, the firelight told it to those who gathered. The river hummed it quietly under moonlight, and in every corner of the village, children and elders alike repeated it in their own words. A tale of betrayal, patience, suffering, and finally restoration. Amara's life became a testament not of revenge, but of balance. The land itself seemed to breathe easier, the forest grew deeper, the river flowed clearer, the animals returned to their paths, the villagers worked without fear, and the story lived on becoming part of the earth and the sky, reminding everyone that those who wrong others may rise for a time, but the truth and the patient heart endure forever, and in this enduring truth lay the ultimate lesson that the greatest ruin of a wrongdoer is not fire or death, but the loss of false power, and the triumph of wisdom, patience and courage, that day and every day after Amara's legacy walked freely in the wind, in the river, in the forests, and in the hearts of those who listened carefully to the lessons carved into the memory of the earth itself. And thus the story ended not with destruction, but with understanding, not with vengeance, but with restoration, not with hate, but with truth. The morals settled into every living thing, that betrayal may bind the body, but the spirit, guided by truth and patience, will always walk free, teaching the generations that follow that justice and wisdom last longer than cruelty, and that the land remembers every act for all time.